Good morning. It's rainy, it's cold. Thank you for coming. Reg has, that was a generous introduction, and he sort of thanked all the relevant people, I suppose. But I do want to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival again and the Kaplan Institute and all my colleagues who invited me. Some caveats. I'm not approaching this talk as a writer or even as an English professor, but as a human being in proximity to a lot of those questions. And the talk has no answers. We only have questions, and so hopefully it'll be short, and then we can have a meaningful dialogue. Sound good? So it's cold, and I know only one joke, so I'm going to use it. Hopefully it'll warm you up. Let's see. So I use it all the time because it's the only non-dirty joke that I know. But it's also, I think, at the heart of it is sort of, it contextualizes the irreverence that I think is important in coming to any kind of intellectual inquiry, and a certain kind of transgression and risk that is necessary to understand anything. It comes from South Africa, and I like the South Africans because they love transgression. So post-apartheid, Nelson Mandela wins the election, and so people fly in from all over for the inauguration ceremony, and a small plane has come in from if you've heard this joke before, just tune out, has flown in from the homelands, and there are 8 passengers on board, 2 black South Africans and 8 white South Africans. A young man, the black is a young man and his son. So as they're leaving to fly back, this little plane develops a problem. One of the engines goes out. So the captain comes on and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're having a problem. We've lost one of the engines and the plane is losing altitude. We have 2 parachutes on board, and in the spirit of the new South Africa, we're asking for volunteers to jump off the plane." And nobody moves. And so he says, "Following the still new South Africa, we're going to go alphabetically. Will all the Africans on the plane please jump off?" And nobody moves. He says, "Will all the blacks on the plane please jump off?" And nobody moves. He says, "Will all the coloreds on the plane please jump off?" And nobody moves. And so this young 9-year-old black African kid turns to his father and says, "Father, if we're not Africans and we're not blacks and we're not coloreds, what are we?" And the father says, "Today, my son, we are Zulus." The good condition, an ethical and artistic. Can you hear me? No? Is that better? Is that better? Yeah, I'm a big man with a small voice. It can be irritating sometimes. I wish I sounded like Barry White, But, I just have the girth and not the voice. The good condition, an ethical and artistic journey. Epigraph, culture of the mind must be subservient to the heart. Mahatma Gandhi. Let me tell you a story. The journey, the elders say, follows the cattle egret, a bird of iridescent whiteness who lives by picking ticks from the hide of cows and buffalo, riding them with the swagger of a surfer as they slog through the mud of rice fields and swamps. This bird of incomparable whiteness alights in that muddy ground to also hunt for mudfish and frogs. Walking with the elegance of a dancer on stilts, picking carefully through steps, charting a complex choreography, this bird, not much bigger than a rooster, has a neck and gait that retains all the serpentine nature of a dinosaur. It walks for a while and then breaks for the sun with a barely audible whoosh and sails into the light, without the slightest speck of dust or mud on its feathers. Always pristine, bridging perfectly the dichotomy of the heavens and earth, a vibrant reminder that transformation is a simple and silent lift from the mud. In the West African, and I start here because I'm going to move between Igbo and Yoruba thought constantly because I think we're the same people. So in West African and more specifically Igbo worldviews, there is little, if any, separation between what we might call the religious and the secular, the seen and the unseen, between metaphor and material substance. It's not so much a religious view as we might be used to thinking, the imposition of an ordered ideal over a chaotic and random world. Instead, it is a symbiotic and fluid exchange of understandings that are in constant flux and change, in constant negotiation, appearing static only in the moment. In this way, the ideas of self and the relationship to the seen and unseen, to identity and our place in the world, are constantly in motion, mediated and approached only through a matrix of metaphor and enactment that themselves, like viruses or simulacra, are never stable or fixed. This is not unlike Homi Bhabha's idea about identity remaining always a state of flux and not a destination. So linguistically, culturally, and artistically, Igbos are always aware of this permanent impermanence, which we call Ike in Igbo or Ashe in Yoruba, and which, for those of you who love sci-fi, literally translates as the Force. It does. I'm not, I wish it was more Skywalker, but it isn't. This fluidity, this flux, is processed and given shape always via the trope of a journey. So as Igbo, we say the journey because there is only one journey. There are many roads and many paths, but only one journey, regardless of the many detours. And this journey is a process of choosing an ideological base for the metaphor of our social contracts, which in my culture is the basis for all philosophy, art, and metaphor. It is the negotiation of a narrative of identity that must remain fluid but categorized, realistic but idealized. It is the long walk to becoming what James Baldwin has called human. The first ones say that we are born in bodies, but humanity is something we earn, something we journey towards. It is in fact a journey of consciousness. Its birth in us, its growth and its expansion, its shape and texture is all that of what we call consciousness. Eniyan, the word for human in Yoruba, means the thinking ones, the ones who have chosen to expand in consciousness. Everything else is simply enon, which is animal, meat, flesh. None of these are indistinct. And so this is a choice we're faced with daily in our contracts in life, be it artistically, be it intellectually, be it in our day-to-day lives, is this choice of human or flesh, consciousness or instinct. It is said that humans dwell in flesh the way the egret dwells in the mud, but we also dwell in a place that is ineffable, like an egret in flight. And so this is a careful balance, a delicate walk, and a precarious in the sense that there is some safety in walking with a group, an institution, even within a religion or a philosophy or an ideology. But in the end, we must walk the path that we carve for ourselves to the place of character, to the place of being human. It's important to understand that in West African thought, character is not in any way connected to morality. Your character is connected to the notion of composure, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So in other words, the notion is if you approach your life through composure leading to thought, thinking will lead you to a place where choices are ethical, not moral. Because the idea is that morality is limited by place, by culture, by understanding, but what is ethical transcends all of these things. So as artists, we are considered, and writers, to be at the forefront of trying to figure out what these negotiations are, which, in my case is a bit of a failure, but nonetheless. In West African thought, all artists must themselves be in constant negotiation, not only with these ideas, but on a personal level, but also in how this is renewed and renegotiated so that the ideas of the human are themselves always adapting. This is where much of the shape of my own artistic engagement and aesthetic principle comes from. And of course, when you layer the fact that in my case, the negotiation must pass through not only the local, but now the global, metaphor and not fixed narratives become even more important. So in a way, the nature of this talk is a reflection of that process of negotiation. In Nigeria, there is a religion that is over 10,000 years old. It is called Ifa, and its prophet was a man called Oromela. This religion is inseparable from its culture, a culture that is based on the moral and ethical thesis that dictates that the individual is responsible for the communal, and the communal is responsible for the individual, and that we are bound in this way to help each other to find a way to bring goodness into the world. The word good and goodness is not used here again in the moral sense, but rather in the sense of that which is robust. That which is simple is not good. That which is robust and complicated and nuanced and complex is good, because life cannot be contained in these simplicities. The holy book of this religion is still mostly in the oral tradition, and part of my research has been to collect these oral narratives and translate them into English. But some of the verses have been translated, and from a chapter of this book, which is called Irosun Iwori, there is a verse that holds beautiful ethical, moral, and political charge. And this is what it says. Let us do things with joy. Those who want to go, let them go. Those who want to stay, let them stay. Surely humans have been chosen to bring good into the world. The all-knowing one, priest of Oromela, interpreted the secret teachings of Ifa for Oromela. He said the people of the world would come to ask him a certain question. He said Orunmila should sacrifice. Orunmila heard and complied. One day, all kinds of people, good people and those who do not allow good in other people's lives, came together. They came to the prophet and they said, coming back and forth to the earth tires us. Therefore, please allow us to rest in heaven when we die. Orunmila says, you cannot avoid going back and forth to earth until you bring about the good condition that the Lord has ordained for every human being, and then you may rest. And they asked him, what is the good condition? And he said, the good condition is a good world, a world in which there is full knowledge of all things, happiness everywhere, life without anxiety or fear of enemies, without clashes with dangerous animals, without fear of death, disease, litigation, losses, wizards, witches, without fear of injury from water or fire, and without fear of poverty or misery. You need wisdom to bring about the good condition, because the good condition is really that ability to understand the world in all its complexity and bring it into being. And the things needed to bring about the good condition in the world are wisdom that is fully adequate to govern the world, sacrifice, character, the love of doing good for all people, and the eagerness and struggle to increase this understanding, this robustness of good in the world, and not let any of it be lost. People will continue to go to heaven, and they will continue to come back to earth even after their transfiguration, until we have all achieved the good condition. In this way, we are responsible for each other. And thus, when the children of the world gather together, those who have chosen to bring good into the world are called human beings. The richness and range and depth of that verse is rooted in a moral conception that human significance lies in service, in moving towards an ethical charge, both in the individual personal sense, but also in the collective cultural sense. And this is why humanities, then the study of the humanities, is perhaps the most important study there is. Because while science is very important, it will prolong your life, without the humanities, there is no meaning to anything. There is no way to understand the significance of anything. There is no way to bring a narrative that allows even the said science to continue to expand. When archaeologists discover cultures are extinct, we're less concerned with whether they actually had any technological inventions. We're more concerned with their art, with the things that they have left behind, even the graffiti they have marked, because this is really what we've come to understand as what makes other kinds of study important. Nice plug for the humanities, by the way. So the charge is this, that you, by virtue of your intelligence and your wisdom, have chosen to negotiate the world through narrative and to continue to extend narratives that continue to allow for this kind of complexity to exist. So we often, when we think in terms only of the religious sense, which obviously religions imply, but I think this is not really about that, we tend to think of it in the idea of a grace that is bestowed upon us, something that is beyond our control. But on careful examination of that verse, it is in fact becomes clear that what we're talking about is an earned and an uneasy grace, a negotiation that makes us active participants in all of those journeys. So as a man who is very versed in research methodologies, I started to think about what I should look to find definitions for grace. And I thought, why not start with my horoscope? So, it's true. So I looked at my horoscope a few days ago, and this was their definition of grace. 1, elegance or beauty of form, movement, or proportion, seemingly effortless fluidity. 2, favor or goodwill, a disposition to be generous or helpful. 3, mercy, forgiveness, charity. 4, a temporary exemption or immunity, a reprieve. 5, a sense of fitness or propriety. 6, a prayer of blessing or thanks said before a meal. 7, an unmerited divine gift offered out of love. So you will find here that the same message of grace can be found in Ifa, but in Ifa it's turned less into the notion of what is bestowed, but more into the notion of what is earned. So in Ifa we're talking about a state of grace involves having wisdom, and wisdom means having a complicated narrative. It involves character, which, as I said earlier, is not about morality but composure. It involves sacrifice, which is always implicit in any kind of journey we make intellectually towards another person. Baldwin always says that love is really an exchange where you give up parts of yourself in order to allow parts of other people to exist. Doing good, which, is always good. Commitment, struggle, and the self-understanding of what it really means that we have undertaken. And what we have undertaken is not a journey which relinquishes our responsibility to something higher, but the journey is simply the idea that we have to work to make all of these things into a complex matrix of metaphor that allows self and other to exist without violence and without shame. Because that is always the problem I think we have, that anytime we try to bring language to otherness, it always involves the shaming of otherness. And this is what we're still struck with as humans, and this is what the good job is to find narratives that are more complex. It also implies action and the will and the drive to bring about whatever the desired state is. So what is being discussed here is not simply the notion of an ideal, but the actual commitment to work on it via our education, but also what we turn that education to and what we put it in service of. This is the very fabric of the humanities, which is in a way a kind of democracy, but one that answers to a higher ethics that we have yet to achieve completely. It's important to note here that the ideals in the work to make transcendence happen are often things that transcend gender, they transcend race, they transcend sexuality, they transcend a nation, and have no, or even a special fixed relationship to a religion or any kind of ideological narrative. And so it seems in order to be human that this ineffable thing that marks us as having dignity rests on being people who can invent and reinvent the narratives to make the world better, or at least better understood, to bring about a more complex and robust understanding. It is also interesting that at no point in the verse is anybody called bad. They are just referred to as those who block goodness from the lives of others. This is carefully worded because it always allows for this concept of transformation, the idea of evolution, of flesh becoming human, the idea that it is possible always to allow others to continuously move from whatever state we hold them in into a state that is more transcendent. At the beginning of the verse was the word joy. Now, joy is a complicated idea. It is both an emotion and a sense of exhilaration, and even a sense of happiness or of unfettered dance. But joy is also an understanding, a place we stand in ambiguity, knowing that what is pleasurable and what is not are transient points, that what we know is not what to be held onto, but rather a place to stand on to begin a deeper inquiry. And this, of course, returns us to the journey. And that this is the hard truth of journey. A path is needed for it to happen, and we must carve the path, our path, scour the detritus from it, fill in or avoid the pitfalls that litter the journey. We must carve this pathway through the morass of our own mud and filth, through the dark parts of ourselves, not to eliminate the darkness, because that would be too much like the egret trying to eliminate the mud that sustains it. No, the path is a conduit between all parts of us. If you want to think neurological pathways, if that helps, then think that. Think neural patterns, for that is what this is really about. Carving, as with all scouring, requires friction, and there will be a lot of it on the path. Death, fear, sorrow, aloneness, but do not get alarmed, because these are all parts of understanding this narrative. These things are gifts that temper our consciousness with understanding, with compassion and empathy, that give us the moral and ethical capacity, the ability even to think and to feel deeply and humanly. This is the consciousness that enables us to become competent, concerned citizens and people. The position of knowledge in this text is a defining characteristic, as it is a defining characteristic of the region itself. Questioning enables deep thought, and that enables taking responsibility for all actions, and yet more difficult, and yet more importantly, taking full responsibility even for things that we do not do, that are done for us or in the name of us. And that idea brings up the idea that we're an unbroken fabric forged by one singular and collective experience. So when you say, I'm an American, which is a beautiful thing to be because it's a beautiful place to live, also remember that your name is attached to every bomb that is dropped on a civilian somewhere in the world. But what of story, of art, of music, of dance and literature? What is its role? Cultures, I have been told, I asked my grandfather this is my grandfather, he didn't go to school, so you can ignore this, but it's beautiful. He told me that cultures who don't tell stories die out, they go extinct. And it's certainly been argued by evolutionary psychologists that the one defining thing that is responsible for the survival of our species of humanoids is story. The singular act to narrativize the world is what allows what is inchoate to inhabit matter to become a reality. Everything is story, and story is everything. Nothing exists outside of it because what cannot be told cannot be shared, and so has a very singular and thus limited use. Stories allow us to curate the world. Knowledge, wisdom, medicine, science, religion, all of it exists because narrative defeats the erosion of time. And it is this unbroken ancestral lineage of story that is the real human achievement. Language is the first and most primordial and most important technology that has ever existed. And this is what makes writers and artists everywhere curators of our collective humanity. In Western thought, composition creates beauty, perspective, symmetry, the golden ratio, an impossible one-sided ideal. In West African thought, composure creates beauty, balance, equanimity, serenity. The essential nature of a thing, its ike or asashe. In Yoruba, we say iwalewa is beauty, and it means the beauty of truth or even the beauty of existence. The word iwa is best translated to mean existence or an eternal state, to be outside of time. Reality is held in Iwa, the calabash of existence. And so in this way, Iwa is connected to an old idea that holds that immortality is the perfect existence, or better, timelessness is the perfect existence. It suggests that all temporality has ramification in an eternal cycle of existence at an individual level, a communal and lineage level, a cultural level, and in many ways at a planetary level. Everyone's Iwa is part of this bigger Iwa, and the perfect balance of all depends on the singular balance of each. Ewa in Yoruba is a word that means beauty, but beauty is a complex thought in West Africa. It doesn't only refer to the visage of things or the surface of things. In Igbo, mma is the word for knife, is also the word for beauty. It means that it sort of creates this constant idea within the language that things are double-edged, no pun intended because it's a knife. But with a slight inflection, what becomes knife is also what becomes good or beauty or goodness. It's what we would think of more in the terms, less in terms of a descriptive matrix, but more in terms of an appreciative matrix. But in both cases, it is a communal process. Beauty is not a concept that works for West Africans in isolation. One cannot be good or beautiful without the participation of others. But there are concepts in beauty that are valued even more. Asampete, which is a beauty in movement, in being, in face, in completeness. So for instance, when we say asampete, we're really talking about the way, how beautiful it is to see the way the sun refracts on the feathers of an eagle in flight. That's really what asampete means. Nganga, which is grace or poise or elegance, or Oma, which is self-awareness or collected balance. So what we're saying is that to make art, it doesn't refer to composition, it refers to an essential conformity to an inner trait. What I tell my students all the time, much to their annoyance, what is the internal logic of your story? That is what determines its external beauty. So it seems that beauty in itself is a state of existence. And so to have beauty or to make art is to exist not only in beauty, but as beauty. And so since Iwa refers to the eternal constant of a person or sometimes a place or thing, to create beauty or to perceive it is to capture or see the essential nature of a thing. And beauty in West African thought lies in recognizing and respecting the uniqueness of all things and all people. To do this in Yoruba, one is said you must cultivate patience, and patience is really what we're talking about here, because patience is the shape that respect takes. And this is a necessary practice, because in order to have an understanding of otherness that is based outside of violence, it has to not be then an easy rendition into a fixed category, but rather the patience to sit always with uncertainty. In this way, you understand that there is no such thing as whiteness or blackness or Africanness or Americanness. There is only humanness that is constantly in flux and constantly trying to negotiate itself. Let me skip some of this. So it seems that to make art requires character, but again, not character in the moral sense, but rather in the sense of composure, the sense that what is being done deserves the highest attention and the deepest insight possible. And this is really what a humanities education offers our students, whether they're in the sciences or in the arts. It is this notion that one spends time in study, and that understanding of things comes through spending time in trying to see all angles of a thing. Singularly dramatic events can change the entire political identity, moral landscape, and ethical engagement of an entire culture. The bombing of the Twin Towers in New York on September 11, 2001 was such an event. We all watched as those towers came crumbling down. We all watched in horror as people on fire jumped from windows for safety, only to die on the sidewalk below. We watched the entire city engulfed with dust. We lost so many people. The rupture of the wound was so severe psychologically that Americans all the way across the country, thousands of miles away from the center of the trauma, experienced a deep psychic break. There are two stories of that event, two that led down two different paths. One from the heart and one from a place of anger, from a morally hobbled leadership whose wisdom was not sufficient to govern the world. And instead of transforming this moment of pain into a moment of action that could heal an entire nation and quite possibly a world, our words spoken were words of anger, and so the war followed. And this is what we have as human beings, that despite all the failure, despite all that failure, we as individuals choose to carve our own paths towards redemption. We choose stories that do not fester with hate, that do not speak of vengeance, but instead of compassion. The second story to come out of that event was from the passengers on those planes that went down that day. These stories come from the phone calls they made to their loved ones. Perhaps these lasting stories are the first poems to ever come out of that event. Fragments of a conversation that would have taken a whole lifetime to have with loved ones were forced into 90-second and even 30-second clips. How do you say to your husband, I love you, and I should have told you I love you more, and I'm going to die in 1 minute, and I miss you? That you will never be there to see your children grow, that you will never witness their football games or go to their graduations. How do you say that in 30 seconds? What possible story can you tell beyond a cliche that says, I love you, that will say to someone, I love you, in the same way that the life you would have lived with them would have proved that you love them? And yet this is the power of story. It continues to transform even the most unspeakable acts into moments of possibility, into moments of robustness. At 8:59 a.m. on that day, passenger Brian Sweeney, a former U.S. Air Force fighter jet pilot, tried to reach his wife Julie and left a message on their home answering machine saying this: the plane has been hijacked. If things don't go well and it's not looking good, I want you to know I absolutely love you. At 9 a.m., Peter Hansen made a call to his father. It's getting bad, Dad. A stewardess was stabbed. I don't think the pilot is flying the plane. I think we're going down. I think they intend to go to Chicago or someplace and fly into a building. Don't worry, Dad. If it happens, it'll be fast. My God. My God. Cece Lyles called her husband and left this message. Hi, baby. You have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a flight that is being hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling you from the plane. I want to tell you that I love you, and please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I hope to see your face again. I love you. The rest of the message cuts off. These are words no one should have to speak or hear. And you might ask what this has to do with bringing the good condition into the world. And I say everything. To face your own death with certainty, and to wish only to leave behind narratives of love, to suppress your own fear, your own panic, your own anger, and your own need, and instead to leave a tangible story that those who love you can hold on to, is an act of goodness. I have had guns pressed to my own head by callous soldiers and even by my own drunk father, and I know this: very few of us can ever face death with grace. This is the power of story. This is why what makes us human can only be negotiated through language, through this kind of robustness. These simple calls, when they began to surface, brought home the human scale of the tragedy. They changed the terms so that now when we speak of that terrible event, we no longer speak only of the loss of lives. We speak also of the sacrifice of firemen and policemen and emergency workers. We speak about the people in the towers as they ran for safety, who trying to get down 89 floors, and yet we never hear that anyone consciously or intentionally trampled anyone else. We talk about the absence of the towers, which perhaps makes them even more present. We speak mostly of good, we speak mostly of healing, we speak mostly of transformation. I come from a small town in southeastern part of Nigeria called Afikpo. And in 1960, in that town, which was mostly Christian, as most of the south of Nigeria is, a group of Muslim clerics arrived. And in that town, at the edge of a dusty road that falls away into a river, they set up a small colony of Muslims, an Islamic school, and an Islamic clinic. And they left it open to everyone to join or not join, but no health or educational services were ever withheld on account of it. There was no rancor for 6 years. There was no hate. And then the Civil War happened in 1966, and mostly Muslim soldiers from the Republic of Nigeria invaded this small town, which was a stronghold of the rebel Biafran forces, and attempted to slaughter everyone. One Muslim cleric, whose name is lost to me and perhaps to most people, opened the gates of that Muslim compound and invited everyone he could in. They gathered around the small mosque that faced Mecca. It was so small it could hold only 40 people at a time. But this Muslim cleric asked people to form concentric circles around the mosque, spreading out as far as necessary. And he said that over 2,000 people bowed in prayer, Muslim, Christian, traditionalists, holding on to the hope that they would not be mistaken for rebels. They faced east, they faced Mecca, all these people prone in multicolored clothes around a small mosque, spreading like a mandala in the sand, and dotted among them like white egrets, true Muslim converts in white robes. And this small imam, 5'3", stood at the gate of the enclave and rebuffed the advancing soldiers of his own religion, saying it was an abomination in Islam to spill the blood of anyone in a mosque. Try to imagine the scene, to imagine the fear, the trembling, try to imagine what could have happened, or try to imagine what it must have taken this 5'3" man, whose name is lost to me and to all of us, to just stand there and protect with his own life all the people he did not know, whose religion he did not know, protect them because that is what his path, what his ethical journey told him it is the right thing to do. In the end, you may wonder why I'm standing here before you telling you all these stories. It is quite simple. As children in Afikpo, we would sing to the flock of flying egrets as they passed, "Chekeleke nye mba ọcha, were mba oji." A simple song, a simple prayer. Egret, oh beautiful egret, fleck my fingernails with white so that I may have honor, so that I may have transformation. And this is really what I am saying, that as a writer, as a teacher, as a scholar, as a man working in the humanities, as a man living in America who has an English mother and a Nigerian father and is possibly multicultural in ways you cannot imagine, I am always trying to find a way within the local and the global context to forge an ethical path so that all the work I make and put into the world works on multiple levels. Thank you very much.
Now we'll open it up to questions. If you'll raise your hand, please, I'll pass you the mic.
Thank you. I'm curious if you have any perspective or opinion on a shift that has occurred globally that may stand in the way of our telling stories. And that is, in the 1950s, the introduction of television, which made stories come to us rather than our making stories, and kind of simultaneously the loss of respect for age and the advent of youth culture also globally, not just here. Does either age or that technology have any impact on our loss of story and therefore our penchant for violence and not doing good and so on?
So an easy question then. So here's the thing. Since I've been speaking a lot about metaphor, in Igbo, a lot of these metaphors occur in what we think of as proverbs. So in Igbo, we say, "Mado anaha banaha mbembe ya noso." A person can never outrun their shadow, because in this way, and because it is good, we can never outrun love. Right? So really, we also sing "Ngwai Ngwai," which is a very simple one. Respect is reciprocal. When I was growing up, for instance, things were scarce. Things like eggs were very scarce in the village, where people. So children were not really given eggs, which kind of makes no sense when you think about it. People who needed the eggs to grow weren't given. It was like the sort of the privilege of the elders, and they would say that if children ate eggs, it would drive them crazy, and they would go out and steal eggs. So in one respect, age itself does not equate wisdom, right, and has created a lot of problematic issues. On the other hand, youth is needed to drive a culture forward, right? So I don't really, first of all, television is amazing. I don't really have any problems with television. I don't think television has changed story. I think it's just another medium for story. It's a performative medium. In the old days, we romanticize books, and books are wonderful, and I shouldn't say this as a writer, but books are a fetish. I mean, the technology of a book. The story is what it's about, and the story has always existed outside of these simple ideas. In the past, not many people saw a scroll or knew how to read one, so stories have always been performed. So think of television in that kind of way as performative stories. What's wonderful is that we've generated thousands of graduates of writing programs who can't publish books, and now they all work in television. And television has become amazing. Even the most despicable things we think about, like reality television, is quite a beautiful way of looking at human life, because what they're working with all the time are these archetypes, and they set up these archetypes and put them in conditions to generate conflict, and then we all have a catharsis. It's very Greek when you think about it. So that's one thing, and I think that so I think the story is always going to be existent. So I think that we have tended to conflate age with wisdom, which isn't always the case, and we've tended to conflate youth with lack of wisdom, which isn't always the case. I think that what we're looking at is a shift in culture. And a shift towards different ways of perceiving narrative and the dissemination of narrative, which in many ways is still deeply rooted in the things. When I think of text messages or Twitter and people say, why are they tweeting their meal? I think of all the times when people would call you and say, I had the most amazing dinner at the Found, you should go there. What's the difference then? Or the ways in which my father would sit drinking beer with his friends and gossip. This is no different from Twitter or any of those other things. It just means you can tell more people, And we complain, but we forget you can switch it off. So what I'm saying is the technology is not the problem. The medium is not the problem. Human beings are storytelling animals, and we will continue to tell story. So I think it's really much more a question of what mediums we're used to receiving the story in. And also young people are pretty amazing. I teach them all the time here, and they humble me every single day. What I think my duty as someone who's older is not to tell them what to do, but to help them develop a matrix of thinking that brings a certain kind of nuanced ideological perspective to the ways in which they disseminate stories. But the beautiful thing is that the way they disseminate stories has moved us actually morally, I think, even ethically, into better places. Obama won the election not because America had had this moral revolution, but because young people were tired of other people telling them how to think. And so this is really a generational shift, and that was achieved largely through the medium of the internet. When I used to teach at University of Riverside, I taught classrooms where kids would disappear and go to the Iraqi war and never come back, and we would never talk about it. So I got tired of this kind of culture of silence. So I started to bring in vets to come and talk about these experiences, particularly those who had lost limbs. Everyone 30 and above always asked them questions that were tinged with loss. How does it feel to not be complete? The kids younger than 20, 25 and under, maybe because of video games, talk to them always in the idea of enhancement. How do you have a prosthetic for running, and one for walking? Do you have one for jumping? In other words, for them, the body is not the residual place of us. It's more in this abstract virtual consciousness place, right? And the problem with our generation is that we're so tied to the body, which is where a lot of the violence comes from, because we're always reacting to your body doesn't belong here. Every time I have tattoos going up my arms, and I live in Evanston, and I go walking in Wilmette near the temple out there, and almost always there's a boundary you cross, which all the people on the sidewalk change towards you. You know, they become extremely polite, but then get closer, they get further and further, or they give you so much room on the path that they're almost in the road, right? Because suddenly my body doesn't belong in Wilmette, right? Do you see what I'm getting at? So I think that we're forging a place between these two things. And so any duty I feel to young people is to help them develop an ideology that allows this non-attachment to body to not become callousness, but to become a more evolved way of thinking of self. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool.
Question. Who else has a question?
Hello. So is there any difference in your ideas about storytelling as it relates to poetry?
Nope. So here's the thing. at least in the way I was raised, a lot of things are largely unknowable. And so for what is unknowable to enter even to the realms of what is knowable, we have to set up these kinds of narratives to negotiate it. So if we kind of break open what we think of narratives and story, a scientific experiment in which you're trying to vulcanize rubber, for instance, is a narrative. And every time it goes wrong, you recreate a new pathway of narrative. So without the narrative that says, how am I going to assemble this experiment to prove this thing, the thing always remains unknowable. So where poetry has a slight different transcendence is where everything else resides in narrative. Poetry, language is the subject of poetry. So the very technology that creates the symbolic orders that we use to make narrative is where poetry begins to push into. So the trick of everything else is that it's trying to bring what is unseen into existence, and what poetry is trying to do is limit what is seen and push into what is unseen. So if you think of a poem on a page, it's not really talking about what's on the page, it's using the words on the page to push into a profundity that cannot be said. So poetry is always dealing in the realm of the ineffable. And so the trick is how do you use narrative. It's like, poetry is like Zen in that way. It's a koan. The more we say, the less we really mean, and it's the less that we mean that opens up the more that we mean. But in a story, we just want to know that a man was walking his dog this morning, right? But in poetry, we say the man was walking his dog this morning, the light, and then his wife and the loss. And once again, another coffin goes into, I'm making this up as we go along, but you can see the difference. One is kind of opening up always into an ineffability, and the other one is narrowing down into a clearer narrative. So, but they're all working within the concept of storytelling. One is a freer story, and one is a much more held together story.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the current events that we are watching of this country of Syria sort of emptying out completely of its people, in the response of its neighboring countries and the European nations, as well as our own response. In your thoughts today, you talked about this humanness as a constant evolution without the personal aspects of nationality or race. Could you tell me how you perceive these current events vis-a-vis Syria?
So again, so Aristotle has three conditions in which compassion need to exist. One is that something awful has happened to someone other than us. Two, that we can imagine ourselves vulnerable in the same way to the same thing. And three, that the thing that has happened is not entirely the person's fault. And this is where compassion falls down, because that narrative that hinges on the third part is where all the problem comes. Because every time we define otherness, it is always otherness's fault for the conditionality they're in. So black youth in Chicago shoot each other in the South Side, not because a systemic failure has resulted in that, but because there's something morally defective about that kind of blackness. And so when you start to look at certain countries who themselves have suffered things, so if you think of Yugoslavia, if you think of all that whole Eastern Bloc, who themselves have had their own humanity scrubbed out by the Soviet Union, and also, let's not pretend that because of our role in the Cold War, we did not participate in that scrubbing, have finally began to find languages for themselves. And of course, no one believes, people don't always like to acknowledge that much of what has happened to them has been about forces beyond their control. So that apartheid ends in South Africa is a lot about Mandela and a lot about de Klerk, but it's really because it became economically unviable for it to continue to exist. And so what we're looking at now in Syria is that the way Syria has been narrativized, and the way Arabs have been narrativized, and the way Islam has been narrativized, has been. I remember growing up as a kid reading the novels of Leon Uris, who was a Jewish propagandist writer, and I used to hate Arabs as a child for no reason, because they had been presented in these narrative ways as defective. So all of the problems in the Middle East are caused by Arabs not being able to find a way forward. It's not the fact that the whole of that area has been subject to invasion, has been subject to constriction by external world forces. So when people begin to spill out of Syria in the way they're spilling out of Syria, overwhelmingly it's seen that these people have messed up their country and they're coming now to take our country and mess it up. So this is what the narrative largely is, and you would think that people who've suffered would be the people who would be more open But often the case is the more you suffer, the more you take on the narrative of violence yourself and begin to, after all, apartheid created by the Boers is because the British held the Boers in concentration camps themselves. So what you're looking at in Syria is not an isolated case of Syria. It's literally the story of the 20th century spilling out into the 21st century, right? All of the Second World War, all of that stuff. And it's therefore no accident that Germany is the one who is most open about this, not because Germans are better, but I think they feel they have a larger sin to atone for. So what's happening, and what have we done? I think we've allowed 1,500 immigrants from Syria. So I think that that's really what the complex narrative is, and always in these kinds of cases. And that's why goodness is robustness. There's no easy answer. There are lots of complicated questions. And the more complicated the narrative becomes, the harder it becomes to create policies that this narrow. I think that what needs to happen is a large worldwide humanitarian effort in Syria, but what we need to do is to stop responding to these hot flashes. There was Rwanda, then it's Syria, then it was the Holocaust. We need to finally come as people to the place where we are asking our own foreign policy to be as morally and ethically upholding as we want other people to be. That's my thoughts about it.
We have time for one more question.
I really appreciate your discussion of the humanities' role in providing meaning. However, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the institutional role of religion, because religion has often been the primary institution that allows us to talk about meaning.
So I keep going back, so I was raised in, my parents were Catholics. I was raised Catholic. I was sent to seminaries to be a priest twice. I got kicked out twice, as you can imagine, for heretical behavior. But simultaneously, I grew up with an Igbo grandfather who was essentially what you might think of as a traditional priest. So I grew up in the matrix of both his kind of understandings of religion. And I find that as I get, the older I get, the more I resort, maybe it's an atavistic idea that you resort to the things that made sense when you were younger, but my grandfather had no formal education, barely spoke any English, but had these very complicated ideas. He always used to say to me that religion is necessary, not as a practice, but as a language. Because he felt that religion was the language through which we articulated the things that were important to us in ways that could not be mocked by others. The problem for him was that once it becomes institutionalized in this way, it now becomes the very opposite of what it's set up to. Rather than as a language to find self-expression, it becomes a language to limit other people's self-expression. So I think that this is the problem with religion, that it has moved out of the context of just like poetry is one more language we need as people, just as science is another language we need. Religion was something we needed for whatever about us that is unconscious or unfathomable. But that language has been moved away from its symbolic negotiations and moved into a more transactional space in the world. And so it becomes about power over time. And that is why people react to religion the way they do. It's not because to be an atheist is to have a religious philosophy. To not believe in God is a religion in itself. You spend a lot of time developing anything you develop a philosophy for, a doctrine for, a way of being for, is a religion, right? In that way, Einstein was very religious. The people in the sciences are very religious. Molecular biology is very religious. It simply is a doctrine of self and of the world. So I think that for me, working within the humanities, my job always as a scholar is to not give any power or centrality to any particular narrative, but to always trouble the narratives all the time. And it's a very hard thing to do because sometimes I occupy a body that is itself the subject of that kind of alienation. And to be in that place and resist that doctrine yourself and try to find ways to continuously open up a conversation is difficult. So I think that if we separate the idea of faith from religion, if religion is a language, then faith is simply the form that language takes for you. Then religion is a very vital part of human existence, just as poetry is, just as music is. And most people who go into it on a private level have no real hate. It is when it comes into the collective that it becomes almost like This is a difficult thing to say. Perhaps even like a sorority, where you were then forced to publicly shame others or publicly agree with things that you might privately not agree with. But it's also a beautiful index for tracking human evolution, for tracking the evolution of thought, for tracking the evolution of mind, and to often understand that whenever we associate with a particular religious figure, we spend a lot of time. So if you think about, if you're thinking in a Christian term, and you think of Jesus, you know, 2 primary commandments: love the Lord thy God, thyself with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. But there's never, he didn't have anything much to say about gay people or gay marriage, but clearly now we do. So what I'm saying is that that's the problem with that kind of linguistic matrix, is that what is expansive can also be used to limit. How Hitler uses the expansiveness of the language of the Third Reich to open up what he considers the right and citizenship of an Aryan race is the same way that it is used to limit the humanity of Jews, and then enables a Holocaust to happen, and for good people to go along with that. So this is always that line. This is always why in traditional religions, which is most of where my own aesthetic comes out of, is this notion that everything is constantly in flux, that every realization is really the basis for another question. Or as a Jewish rabbi would say, you know, we don't look for answers, we look for better questions. And this is really what the humanities does. We're not really looking for answers, we're looking for better questions. So all of the scholarship, no matter how we may think unimportant, is all it's doing is constantly looking at all the ways to keep expanding the questions that are possible. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.